welcome back. It is so good to be in here with you all. I know those of you who are watching, we love you, and we are so glad that you are able to join us, even if it's remotely. We are living in some pretty odd times. There's been a lot that has changed since the last time we were able to gather together in a building like this to worship together as a church family. And there's still a lot changing even now. But I am grateful that one of the trending changes that is taking place is things opening back up, right? Churches opening, businesses, and all kinds of other things. And as a church, you'll notice that we've made some adjustments as well. There's hand sanitizer all over the place. The chairs are spaced apart. For the time being, we are only having worship services, not Sunday school, not children's church, not nursery. Not to mention that we've made our sermons available not just on YouTube, but on Facebook, as well as on our website. And we've even started a podcast where I interview different people about relevant topics that kind of tie into the sermon series that we're doing. I say all that to say, we are living in a new kind of normal. So how do we do that? How do we navigate this new normal? More to the point, how do we do that without losing ourselves in the process? And if I'm going to be honest, keeping up with all of the changes that was going on in our world was just flat out exhausting. And to have to figure out what changes, we need to make as a church, it's an exhausting process. So how do we do that? How do we navigate the new normal without losing ourselves mentally, emotionally, physically, and even spiritually? Well, that's the question that we're going to be looking at today. We're going to start a brand new sermon series through the book of Daniel, which is a book in the Old Testament that contains 6 nail-biting, adrenaline-pumping, awe-inspiring stories of bravery, of faithfulness, and defiance, and then 6 chapters of a strange sci-fi-like visions and dreams that challenge the way that we read our Bible, challenge the way that we understand the future, and challenge the way that we see nations. And today we begin Daniel chapter 1. And we are introduced to 4 key people: Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. But what makes this book so interesting and relevant is that they are focused on this new normal, on how to live in this new normal. I mean, they are living in enemy territory, but not only that, they are living in the enemy territory that they have been captured into and are held as, in a way, prisoners of a very powerful nation, the nation of Babylon. I mean, they swept through the land, they destroyed and took people as their own subjects to do with them as they pleased in Babylon. I mean, this is what the Bible calls the exile. And from this point on in biblical history, everything pivots. The king of Babylon had one goal in mind, and it is expanding the borders of his kingdom. He wanted as much power and control as possible, which meant acquiring much land, removing occupants, and dethroning any opposition standing in his way. And Israel happened to be just one of the targets. The land was laid waste, fields and homes destroyed, city leaders and pastors and priests and prophets and all others were taken, and a handful of them left behind. And from the outside looking in, you would think that Israel was in the wrong place at the wrong time. But Daniel tells us a different story altogether. But before we get there, before we get to that story, let me tell you an exile story that recently we experienced in our own home. Last week, Stephanie walked into our daughter's room during her rest time, and there she found Augustine, sitting on the floor with a circle of dolls lining around, and Minnie Mouse was in the middle of the circle. Stephanie called this the Council of Minnie. And Stephanie asked Augie, what's going on here? And so Augie told her that Minnie Mouse wasn't being very nice, and so they were, her and the dolls were gathering around to decide what to do with Minnie. The next thing we know is Minnie Mouse is in our bathroom, tucked away peacefully in a basket. Minnie got exiled in our own home. And being the gracious dad that I am, who's getting ready to preach on Daniel, decided to smuggle Minnie back into Augie's room, out of exile and into her homeland, Augie's bedroom. And the next day, she handed Minnie back, and she said that since Minnie Mouse is not nice, she's not pretending that she's real anymore. But then she looked at Stephanie and pretended that Minnie Mouse, came back to life and was nice again, and said, I thought Minnie Mouse was evil, but I guess she's okay now. and just like that, right? Here's my sermon opener. I tell you that story simply to say that what happened to Minnie Mouse is similar to what happened to Israel. Give or take a few details, okay? Minnie wasn't nice, and she got deported to the bathroom, but she was later restored. And Israel didn't live up to her end of the covenant with God and got exiled into Babylon, but was later restored. The overarching point of Daniel chapter 1, and for us today, is this. The place God brings you is not the place He leaves you. So with that in mind, let's dive into our text, Daniel chapter 1, verse 1. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. Babylon had been at war trying to expand its kingdom by going to battle with other national powers in their day. Nebuchadnezzar's dad made some good efforts to move his kingdom forward, but they found themselves at odds with another world power, Egypt. Egypt had at this time had control of Israel and had put into power Jehoiakim as their kind of puppet king. This put Israel in really a rock and a hard place, which ended up with them being conquered and deported to the Babylon. But this was not just an unfortunate timing for Israel. It wasn't just a coincidence. This was part of God's plan. Verse 2, and the Lord delivered Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, along with some of the articles from the temple of God. These he carried off to the temple of his God in Babylon and put in the treasure house of his God. The single phrase, the Lord delivered, is the major theme of the book. While it would have been tempting to see all of the events that had taken place as God abandoning his people, you actually get a picture that God was doing something much bigger. More importantly, from the ancient Near East perspective, they believed that what happened on earth was a correspondence to what happened in the spiritual world. So if a nation is defeated, it meant that their gods got defeated. So by Israel being defeated, everybody in Babylon would have thought that the gods of Babylon had beat the God of Israel. But Daniel tells us something subtle and yet profound. It wasn't Babylon who delivered Israel into their hands. It was actually their God. And it was God who was using Babylon for a greater purpose that they didn't even know about. Why? Because the place God brings you is not the place He leaves you. But why would God do that? Well, it actually goes all the way back to the first time that God called His own people to be His own people. The first time God called Israel to be His people. God allowed humans to enter into a covenant relationship with Him. The closest thing that we have to a covenant today is a marriage. And when we enter into the marriage relationship, we are entering into a legally binding relationship. But unlike today, a covenant carried benefits for those who lived according to the covenant rules, or covenant policies, if you will. And there's consequences if you broke the covenant. Or as the Bible puts it, blessings and cursings. And this is how covenants just work. I mean, if you do this here, all right, if you do this that is written down in God's Word, here is the good things that is going to come to you. But if you don't do these, or you do the bad things in them, here is the bad consequences that are going to follow. Exile was one of those consequences that would follow. Deuteronomy 28:15 puts it like this. But if you will not obey the voice of the Lord your God, or be careful to do all His commandments and His statutes that I command you today, then all these curses shall come upon you and overtake you. And then Moses lists a bunch of consequences. And repeated throughout this contractual moment, God reminds them that breaking covenant relationship with him would exile them. And here is just one example of this, verses 36 and through 41. The Lord will bring you and your king, whom you set over you, to a nation that neither you nor your fathers have known. And there you shall serve other gods of wood and stone, and you shall become a horror, a proverb, and a byword among all the prophets where the Lord will lead you away. You shall carry much seed into the field, and shall gather in little, for the locust shall consume it. You shall plant vineyards and dress them, but you shall neither drink of the wine nor gather the grapes, for the worms shall eat them. You shall have olive trees throughout all your territory, but you shall not anoint yourself with oil, for your olives shall drop off. You shall father sons and daughters, but they shall not be yours, for they shall go into captivity. This is the reality that Israel is living in the book of Daniel. They have for years lived in disobedience and disregard, and so God does what he said he would do. He let them be overtaken by a more powerful nation. But there's hope. How? Because the place that God brought them, Babylon, is not the place he leaves them. Deuteronomy chapter 30 says it like this. And when all these things come upon you, the blessings and the curse, which I have set before you, and you call them to mind among all the nations where the Lord your God has driven you, and return to the Lord your God, you and your children, and obey his voice and all that I command you today, with all your heart and with all your soul, then the Lord your God will restore your fortunes and have mercy on you. And he will gather you again from all the peoples where the Lord your God has scattered you. How's that for an introduction? We are 10 minutes in, and we've only introduced the book of Daniel. Not to mention that we've only covered 2 verses, and there is 19 more to go. Welcome back to church, I guess. But here's what I want you to know about the book of Daniel and why it is relevant to your life. Daniel and his people, they have been thrusted into a new normal, and they have to figure out how to live in this new life. I mean, everything for them is different in Babylon. And while I will not say, nor can anyone say, that God caused this virus, I think that kind of response is just, first and foremost, irresponsible to say. We are living in a new normal. We can say that. And we have to learn how to live in this new normal. And so Daniel, he shows us a glimpse into how to do that. He shows us a glimpse into how Daniel and his friends adjusted to their new normal. And so let's look at their new normal. Starting in verse 3 of Daniel chapter 1. Then the king ordered Ashpenaz, chief of his court officials, to bring into the king's service some of the Israelites from the royal family and the nobility. The first thing we learn about Daniel and his friends is that they were important people in Israel. I mean, they were already highly educated and from the royal family line. The practice of exiling a nation was to take away the elites from a nation and leave the others. This way, the kingdom acquires people who can benefit their empire as well as secure a defeat from the nation, rebuilding and attacking. Daniel continues in verse 4. Young men, scholars guess that they were teenagers or possibly no older than in their 20s, without any defect, physical defect, handsome, showing aptitude for every kind of learning, well-informed, quick to understand, and qualified to serve in the king's palace. He was to teach them the language and literature of the Babylonians. The plan is to find the cream of the crop and groom them into the best vessels for the kingdom of Babylon. To do that requires intensive training, which is exactly what they do with Daniel and his friends. But this is not just any kind of training. This is for the service in the king's palace. And as I was studying this, researching this passage, I found 5 of the most common roles for a royal service. They were an astrologer and scribes, that is, being able to interpret different signs and dreams and visions. And to do that, you had to be familiar with the kingdom's literature that talked about the different visions and dreams, the signs and symbols and what they mean. And there was also diviners, right? This is those who communicated with the underworld, or exorcists or physicians, and even chanters of lamentation. Now, we don't know what the specific role they were appointed for is. I mean, the text doesn't say, but given the fact that Daniel is somebody who interprets dreams, later on, it's more than likely that he's appointed to be kind of the astrologer, scribe role, that kind of sort. It's highly likely that their training involves duties for the gods of Babylon. I mean, their training had religious and political overtones to it. Let's continue in verse 5. The king assigned them a daily amount of food and wine from the king's table. They were to be trained for 3 years, and after that, they were to enter the king's service. Among those who were chosen were some from Judah: Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah. The chief official gave them new names. To Daniel, the name Belshazzar; to Hananiah, Shadrach; to Mishael, Meshach; and to Azariah, Abednego. They undergo training for 3 years, and then they get released for service. And we might not think too much of it today that they got their names changed, but in the ancient world, this was a big deal. Embedded in your name was the God that you belonged to. It symbolized a sort of ownership or belongingness. And so by renaming them, they are not just given names that are in the Babylonian language, but their names kind of have this orientation shift in their very identity to the identity of belonging to the gods of Babylon. And Daniel, for example, his name means God is my judge. And his name gets changed to Belshazzar, which can either mean may a god protect his life, or Lady Goddess protect the king. And what is remarkable is the fact that they don't choose to fight this battle. They don't choose to fight the battle. And so here is their new normal. They are abducted from home. They are forced to live in a foreign land, and they are indoctrinated to serve and perform, from what we can tell, religious services for the king, and they are trained, and from what we can tell, in the Babylonian scriptures, and they get renamed. They get their names changed after the Babylonian gods to show this sort of transferring of loyalty. That's quite a new normal, isn't it? I mean, how many of you would have fought back at any of those points? I mean, they're almost like full-fledged Babylonian at the end of the 3-year training. And if they go all in, they will lose themselves completely. But Daniel and his friends, they do draw the line in the sand. They do say enough is enough. They do draw the line in the sand from being fully integrated into the Babylon culture, but it's not where many of us, it's not likely where you would have drawn the line in the sand. Where do they do that? Verse 8. But Daniel resolved not to defile himself with royal food and wine. And he asked the chief official for permission not to defile himself in this way. They drew the line in the sand with food. food and drink. Not name changes, not a higher property tax, not relocation, nor the loss of their property, but the finest of foods and drink. Can I just be honest with you? That's weird. I mean, to me, it sounds like they have mixed up priorities. I'd be tempted to tell Daniel and his friends, dude, if you didn't want to defile yourself, you kind of done messed up when you signed the certificate to have your name changed, right? Why food and drink? There are all kinds of reasons proposed by scholars, but honestly, nobody really knows. Some say they didn't want to defile themselves because of the Jewish dietary laws. But the problem with that is that they said no to items that they were actually permitted in their own laws to enjoy. The best explanation that I have found is that they had to take a stand on something to avoid total and complete assimilation to the Babylonian culture. What was defilement for them was not the food and drink, but the loss of their identity as being the people of God. And by drawing the line in the sand and requesting a 10-day period to test them, they were able to give credit to their God in the midst of the royal offices. And they can say, success belongs to our God, not Babylon. And by doing so, they did not lose themselves even while they lost their old way of life. And so they make a request to eat only vegetables. They are granted 10 days, and then they surpass everyone else, right? Verse 15, at the end of the 10 days, they looked healthier and better nourished than any of the young men who ate the royal food. So the guard took away their choice food and wine. They were to drink and gave them vegetables instead. The point being made, our God has not abandoned us here. And He can and will give them success even if that's in the pagan empire of Babylon. This point becomes even more obvious when we read this starting in verse 17. To these 4 young men, God gave them knowledge and understanding of all kinds of literature and learning. And Daniel could understand visions and dreams of all kinds. And every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king questioned them, he found them 10 times better than all of the magicians and enchanters and in the whole kingdom. And Daniel remained there until the first year of King Cyrus. This is the 3rd time we read God gave. The point is unmistakable. God did not abandon them. No, God gave them over. God did not abandon them to ruthless overlords. No, God gave them favor in their eyes. God did not abandon them to failure. No, God gave them success with whatever they put their hands to, whatever they put their mind to, which makes the point very clear. The place God brought them is not the place He leaves them. God is in complete control. In fact, to mention King Cyrus in verse 21 makes the point that Daniel outlasts the people who conquered him. This is the message that provides hope for those who have to live in a land that is so foreign, a land that is so new. This is a message that gives hope to people who are having to figure out how to live in a new kind of normal. And so when we look at Daniel, we see somebody who navigated the new normal of Babylon with great success without losing himself. We also see a God who never once abandoned them, even if it totally looked like He had. Right? Circumstance told a different story than what they were experiencing. So what do we learn today about how to live when we are thrusted into something new and different that affects much of who we are and much of how we live? Well, if you're taking notes, here's what I believe Daniel chapter 1 teaches us about how to navigate the new normal without losing yourself completely. No, faithfulness is more lasting than comfort and convenience. No, faithfulness is more lasting than comfort and convenience. And if you can learn one thing from the trial Daniel and his friends experienced, it was a test of abandoning their own identity for a lifestyle of Babylon, which couldn't have been any more luxurious than what they were experiencing. All the education, all the riches, foods, relationships, and power that they could have ever dreamed of was right there for them. But it would cost them their very own faithfulness to God. To them, heading into Babylon, that was a loss that they weren't willing to lose. They went headlong into this new normal, clinging on to this principle that whatever opportunities are presented to them, our choice to be faithful is more lasting than anything else. And this is the message of the Bible. Delay momentary convenience for eternal rewards. James chapter 1 says it like this: Blessed is the man who remains steadfast under trial, for when he has stood the test, he will receive the crown of life, which God has promised to those who love him. Hebrews 10. Therefore, do not throw away your confidence, which has a great reward. For you have need of endurance, so that when you have done the will of God, you may receive what is promised. Revelation 2:10. Don't be afraid of what you are about to suffer. The devil will throw some of you into prison to test you. You will suffer for 10 days, but if you remain faithful, even when facing death, I will give you the crown of life. So the perspective for us and how we handle our new odd normal is that we have to have this mindset that whatever comes my way, however hard it is, in spite of where it will exile me to, I will be somebody who is faithful in this season. I will be one who, regardless of the hardship, regardless of the struggle, I will be somebody who is faithful because I know what is on the other side of this. The second, if you're taking notes, is this: choose biblical compliance over cultural relevance. Choose biblical compliance over cultural relevance. This is the key with Daniel 1. Daniel and his friends here and throughout this book choose to be loyal to the one God who has revealed himself to us in his word and has showed us how he wants us to live. And there are times when how we should live and what we should believe runs into conflict with the culture that we are a part of. I mean, this was true then, it's true throughout history, and it remains true even today. We live in two kingdoms, the kingdom of heaven and the kingdom of earth. And Jesus tells us to be as wise as servants and as innocent as doves. Our citizenship is first and foremost in heaven. Our loyalties belong to God. As a result, this makes us here on earth the best possible citizens in the kingdom of earth. But not to the extent where we forfeit our heavenly citizenship. And I wish I had kind of this bullet point list to give you about when it's okay to say to culture and authorities, I choose God over man. But it's hard. It's a fine line. My best advice, the best advice that I have to give is to say it requires a lot of wisdom, a lot of discernment, and a whole lot more prayer. The greatest threat, though, is not what gets enforced or legislated, but what sneaks through the back door of your life that we rarely see as a threat. Right? I mean, kind of like food and wine. And we see Daniel putting his foot down on the subtleties that would have had a longer effect on shaping him and the others. So what would that be for you? What would that be for us here in America? The point where I think we need to choose biblical compliance over cultural relevance is in the worship of self, the worship of ourselves. I mean, it sounds odd, but that's the God of this continent. Tremper Longman, who wrote a commentary on this, he put it like this. Christians today should understand that we too live in a toxic culture. That is a culture that stands at odds with our faith. The God of modern culture is not the God of the Bible, but ultimately the self. This strange God demands worship that creates values different than those of Christianity. Since the individual is at the heart of the worship of secular culture, personal gratification and self-realization are prized over any sense of the other person, any sense of community. And in this season, it is the God of self that is making its voice all the louder. You need to find yourself. You need to tell everyone else what you think. I mean, it's your highway, or it's your way, or it's the highway. I mean, you deserve respect. You deserve your way. You deserve to be worshiped. Look for the subtle ways that you have been eating from the royalties of the palace of the food of self. And this is the most persuasive God today, and yet it is the most deadly today. Because we get our way, and we feel yet more emptier on the inside as a result. It promises us to be an empire, to build an empire, to be an emperor, and yet we feel as poor as ever. What people need is not a world built around self, but a world built around God. The third point to keep in mind in navigating this new life is not just about surviving, but being missional. That is, to be a kingdom representatives. Therefore, we need to practice this missional integration. Missional integration. As followers of Jesus, our life is not about resisting everything from the world. It's not about making sure that we look nothing like the world. Being a follower of Jesus is about being on mission in our world, which means we've got to actually integrate ourselves into the world in a way that does not compromise our commitment to Christ so that we can relate Christ to the world. I mean, this is precisely what God called Daniel and his friends to do. And he gave them success in knowledge of the Babylonian literature, which, by the way, does not mean God agreed with or affirmed what the Babylonians taught. It simply means that God gave them knowledge in it for the sake of the kingdom mission. How so? Well, as it will become apparent as we read through the book of Daniel, these become the keys. This training becomes the key to interpreting the dreams and the vision. And God will use this for a greater impact. God repurposes this. And God used their literary learning to communicate scriptural truth about God. They don't substitute as truth. They form this platform to communicate the truth. Now, the same I would say to you, that if we want to be like Daniel, then it is going to require you a willingness to learn, listen, and study up on the literature, life experiences, and the worldview of others for the sake of kingdom mission. Paul put it this way in 1 Corinthians. For though I am free from all, I have made myself a servant to all, that I might win more of them. To the Jews I become as a Jew in order to win Jews. To those under the law, I become as one under the law, though not being myself under the law, that I might win those under the law. To those outside the law, I become as one outside the law, not being outside the law of God, but under the law of Christ, that I might win those outside the law. To the weak, I become weak, that I might win the weak. I have become all things to all people, that by all means I might save some. I do it all for the sake of the gospel, that I might share with them in its blessings. When Jesus' death on the cross and resurrection from the grave truly becomes your life, it becomes everything to you. I mean, you do not simply become a one day, a week Christian. You become a Christian totally in everything in your life. Everything changes, including the way you navigate through the new normal. And if I understand Paul correctly, what he is telling us is that to enter into this new normal, we need to do it for the sake of others. Hearing about Jesus, like that's the goal. So to navigate this life, we have to remain faithful. We have to remain committed to biblical truth and a missional integration of our lives in the here and now. But the greatest lesson from Daniel chapter 1 is not so much about teaching us how to behave, but pointing us to God. And why does that matter? Because the place God brings you is not the place He leaves you. Hey, thanks so much for joining us online. As many of you know, we have begun opening back up our in-person worship gatherings, and there's all kinds of changes that we have made to ensure that this is a safe and sanitary place for you. We truly do value gathering together as a church, but look, we understand that some people, they're not comfortable gathering back together, and as a leadership, we understand completely, and we are not passing judgment on anyone who wishes to stay home in this time. Look, we love you and we miss you, and we want to make this an experience where you can worship right alongside with us. So we have made these messages available. So as we have these services live, you can also tune into the messages as well. We would still love to hear from you, how you're doing, how we can be praying for you. If there are new decisions that you have been wanting to make spiritually, we would love to know. You can simply just go to our website, thechristianchurchoflitchfield.com. There you will find a digital connection card. As soon as you go to the website, it will pop up on the screen. Please take a couple of moments just to fill that out. Let us know who you are, that you're watching. Maybe it's your first time. We'd love to know that. We would also love to know if there's any spiritual decisions that God has been working on your heart that you need to make, and how we also can be praying for you. Also, you will find a giving button that will take you to our church's PayPal account. And I would encourage you to continue to give to the church in this new normal. We give in a response out of worship to a God who has given us His own life, sending His Son to be a sacrifice for our sin. Giving is an act of worship. And there are many ways to keep giving through PayPal, mailing a check into the church, stopping by the office, or simply setting up auto payment through your bank. This coming Wednesday, I am really excited to share with you an interview I did with Dr. Scott Wombo from St. Louis Christian College. Scott has been teaching Bible interpretation for over 20 years, and he has even done postgraduate work in this area as well. Well, I had a chance to sit down with Scott and talk with him about why is the Bible so difficult, and what do you do when you run into a difficult passage? How do you approach that? How do you interpret that? I mean, it's a great conversation, and you'll be able to find that interview this coming Wednesday on Facebook, Wednesday at 10 a.m., or you can just simply find it on the App Store. Just search Unpacked with Skylar, and you'll be able to find it there. Church, we love you, and we are so grateful that we can gather once again in a building like this, but we want you to know that those of you who are tuning in digitally, we love you, we haven't forgotten you. Hang in there, and we look forward to seeing you soon.